A shocking story from Houston. A pastor committed a horrifying act after a DNA test revealed that his only son was not actually his, but his own brother's. Overcome with rage and betrayal, the man took a drastic step. He dissolved his wife in acid. What do you think about this chilling story? Share your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next updates.
Leonard "Lenny" Whitaker was the kind of man people admired. He wasn't just a pastor. He was a leader, a mentor, a man who lived by the words he preached. In Houston's Sunnyside neighborhood, his church was more than a place of worship. It was a community. People came to hear his sermons, drawn in by his passionate messages about faith, family, and integrity. He spoke with conviction, often using his own life as an example of God's grace and the power of a strong marriage. Lenny and his wife, Celeste, had been together for almost 18 years, and to the outside world, their marriage was something to aspire to. Every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit and spoke about the importance of commitment, often praising Celeste in front of the congregation. He called her his God-given partner and talked about how she was the rock that kept their home together. Their love, he said, was proof of what happened when two people built their relationship on faith. And then there was their son, Elijah. If Lenny ever softened, it was when he talked about Elijah. He would smile, his voice filled with pride, as he described how he and Celeste had raised a fine young man, a smart, well-mannered boy who had grown up surrounded by love. To everyone watching, the Whitakers were a model family, a pastor with a devoted wife and a bright, respectful son. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Lenny had always carried a quiet doubt, one he never voiced, not even to his closest friends. Elijah didn't look like him. At first, it wasn't something he thought too much about. Genetics were unpredictable, and people often said the boy favored Celeste's side of the family. But as Elijah grew older, the differences became harder to ignore. His facial structure, the way he walked, even his expressions, they didn't mirror Lenny at all. What troubled him even more was that some of Elijah's mannerisms reminded him of someone else, his brother, Maurice. Maurice was Lenny's younger brother, the wild one, the one who never settled down. He had always been different from Lenny. While Lenny devoted his life to the church, Maurice lived freely, never tied to any real responsibilities. He drifted in and out of jobs, relationships, and even their lives. There were years when they barely spoke, but whenever Maurice showed up, it was like he had never left, always charismatic, always confident, always the center of attention. Lenny started thinking back, piecing together memories he had ignored for years. Maurice had been around a lot when Celeste was pregnant. Back then, Lenny had seen it as nothing more than his brother being supportive. Maurice and Celeste had always gotten along, maybe even too well. There had been moments, fleeting glances, laughter that lasted a little too long, whispers Lenny couldn't quite hear, but he had never let himself believe anything could have happened. Celeste was his wife, the mother of his child. Maurice was his brother. It wasn't possible. And yet, the doubt never left him. It lingered sitting at the back of his mind, always there but never spoken. He told himself it was ridiculous that Celeste would never betray him like that. He convinced himself that family didn't have to look alike to be real. But the thoughts crept in at the most unexpected moments. When Elijah laughed a certain way, when Maurice stopped by and their voices carried the same tone when people joked, "Man, that boy looks nothing like you." Still, he kept it buried. He had built his life on faith, and faith meant trust. Trust in Celeste, trust in his family, trust that the doubts in his head were nothing more than the devil's whispers. No one outside their home ever saw the cracks. To the congregation, to friends, to neighbors, the Whitakers were unshakable. And Lenny made sure to keep it that way. Because if the truth ever came out, it wouldn't just break his heart. It would destroy everything. Lenny had always been a man of faith, a man who trusted in God's plan. But faith had never been enough to quiet the doubts in his heart. The thoughts had haunted him for years, creeping in at unexpected moments, eating away at his peace. And no matter how much he tried to push them away, they always came back. At first they were just whispers, fleeting moments of unease that he dismissed as paranoia. He would look at Elijah, his son, his boy, and tell himself there was nothing to question. But then there were the small things, the ones he tried to ignore. The way Elijah's features never quite lined up with his own, the way people sometimes hesitated when they said, "He looks just like you." The way, as Elijah grew older, he started to remind Lenny of someone else entirely. And then there was Celeste, his wife of nearly 18 years, the love of his life, or at least she had been. There was a time when he had trusted her without hesitation, but over the years that trust had worn thin. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way she avoided his gaze when he brought up the past. Maybe it was the guilt in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Maybe it was just intuition. Whatever it was, it had finally become too much. So, on January 5th, 2024, Lenny made a decision that would change everything. He didn't tell Celeste. He didn't tell Elijah. He didn't tell a soul. He simply walked into a drugstore, bought a DNA test, and took it home. That night, while Elijah was asleep, Lenny took a sample of his son's hair and sealed it in the test kit. The next morning, he mailed it off, his hands steady but his heart pounding. He told himself he was doing it to put his mind at ease, that once the results came back, he would finally be free from the thoughts that had tormented him for so long. But deep down, he already knew the truth. For nearly 2 weeks, he carried the weight of what he had done. He still went to church, still preached about love and trust, still stood before his congregation as the man they all believed him to be. He still kissed Celeste before bed, still laughed with Elijah at the dinner table. But inside, he was unraveling. Then, on January 17th, the results arrived. He had been in his study when he got the notification. It was just a simple email, an unassuming subject line. But when he opened it, the truth stared back at him in black and white. 0.00% probability of paternity. Lenny stared at the screen, numb, his entire body cold. He read it again. And again. His breath caught in his throat. His chest tightened. He had suspected, but seeing it confirmed. It was like someone had ripped the floor out from under him. But there was another number on the report. A 25% DNA match. Lenny's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't Elijah's father, but he was still a close biological relative. That meant one of two things. Either his father had secretly had a child with Celeste, or his stomach turned. Maurice, his brother. The only way to be sure was to confirm it. Lenny didn't say a word to Celeste that night. He barely spoke at all. The next morning, without telling anyone, he ordered another DNA test, this time one that would check Elijah's relation to Maurice. But how would he get Maurice's DNA without raising suspicion? Maurice had come over for a family gathering on January 10th, just a few days after Lenny first got the shocking results. It wasn't unusual. Maurice had always been close to the family, visiting often, especially during the holidays. Lenny watched him that evening, studying every little interaction. Had Celeste and Maurice ever looked at each other too long? Had he missed something all these years? Maurice, completely unaware of Lenny's suspicions, left his beer bottle on the kitchen counter when he stepped outside to take a call. Lenny's hands moved on instinct. He grabbed the bottle, wrapped it in a napkin, and hid it under the sink. Later that night, when everyone had left and Celeste had gone to bed, Lenny retrieved the bottle. He scraped the rim with a cotton swab, sealed it in a plastic bag, and sent it off for testing. He didn't sleep that night. His mind ran in circles, trying to convince himself he was wrong. But 5 days later, when the results arrived, there was no denying it. 99.9% probability. Maurice was Elijah's father. Everything inside Lenny went still. His brother. His own flesh and blood. Maurice had been in and out of his life for years, never truly settling down. He had always been the reckless one, the one who never took anything seriously. While Lenny had built a life with Celeste, Maurice had drifted from one city to another, chasing quick money and short-lived relationships. But there had been a time when Maurice was around more often. Right around the time Celeste got pregnant. The memories started piecing together. Maurice had been staying with them back then, crashing on their couch for a few weeks after one of his failed business ventures. Lenny had been busy with church, often away late at night, trusting that his wife and brother would be safe under the same roof. It had never crossed his mind that anything could happen. Not with family. Had Maurice known? Had Celeste? Had they laughed behind his back all these years, watching him play the fool? The rage came slowly at first, a dull, creeping thing that rose from the pit of his stomach and spread through his veins like fire. His hands curled into fists, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. He couldn't think, he couldn't breathe. The love, the trust, the nearly 2 decades of marriage, it all collapsed in an instant. By the time Celeste came home that evening, Lenny had made up his mind. It wasn't a conversation, it wasn't even an argument, it was a reckoning. When Celeste walked through the door, Lenny was waiting for her. He was sitting in the living room, the DNA test results printed out on the coffee table. He didn't yell, he didn't throw accusations, he just pointed at the papers and told her to explain. Celeste's face went pale. She didn't touch the papers. She didn't move. She just stood there, eyes wide, lips trembling. And in that moment, Lenny knew. She had known all along. He stood up slowly, his body tense, his heart pounding. "Say something," he demanded, his voice low, shaking with barely contained fury. Celeste opened her mouth, but no words came out. And then she started crying. That was all it took. The rage that had been simmering for weeks, months, years finally boiled over. Lenny didn't remember grabbing her. He didn't remember the first shove, the first scream. All he remembered was red. The sound of Celeste begging him to stop, the crash of furniture as she stumbled back, the way the room blurred as his vision tunneled in rage. He had never put his hands on her before, never even thought of hurting her. But now he couldn't stop. At 11:42 p.m., a neighbor would later recall hearing what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by silence. By January 19th, Lenny had already begun carrying out the plan that had taken shape in his mind the night he confronted Celeste. The rage that had first consumed him had settled into something else, a cold, deliberate determination. He knew what had to be done. That morning, he drove nearly 40 miles to an industrial supply store outside of town, choosing a location where no one would recognize him. He walked in, calm and measured, his expression betraying nothing. He scanned the shelves until he found what he was looking for: 3 large containers of sulfuric acid, the kind powerful enough to strip metal to erase evidence. He lifted them onto the counter, his arms steady. The cashier, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, barely glanced at him. "Big project?" she asked casually as she rang up his purchase. Lenny gave a polite smile. "Something like that." He paid in cash, loaded the containers into his trunk, and drove home. Once inside the garage, he shut the doors, sealed the windows, and got to work. For the next 3 days, no one suspected a thing. Lenny moved through life as if nothing had changed. He returned calls, answered messages, even led Sunday service with his usual composure. His voice, steady and warm, preached about faith, about redemption, about the path to righteousness. And when people asked about Celeste, he told them she had gone on a church retreat, a sudden, unplanned trip, somewhere without cell service. It was a believable excuse. Celeste was a woman of deep faith. No one questioned it. But inside the garage, the truth was hidden in plain sight. The containers sat in the farthest corner, tightly sealed, filled with corrosive liquid and what was left of his wife. The acid hissed and bubbled as it worked, breaking down flesh, muscle, sinew, but some things resisted. Bones, teeth, the stubborn remnants of a life that refused to disappear. Lenny had read about this, had planned for it, but he hadn't truly understood what it would look like until he saw it with his own eyes. He hadn't understood the stench. The thick, suffocating odor that clung to him, soaked into the walls, filled every breath. He barely ate, barely slept. His mind buzzed with the details of his plan, but there was one thing he had not accounted for. Then, on January 22nd, the plumbing failed. At first, it was just a slow drain. The water in the sinks took longer to disappear. The pipes made strange, gurgling noises. Then the garage floor became damp. A thin, sticky film formed near the drain, and the smell, chemical, rotting, unbearable, began to seep into the house. Lenny tried to fix it himself. He poured more chemicals down the pipes, tried flushing the system, but nothing worked. The plumbing was clogged. The acid, the dissolved remains, they had traveled through the pipes, and now the house was rejecting them. By that afternoon, he had no choice. He called a plumber. Chris Baines arrived at 3:15 p.m. A tall, solidly built man in his late 40s, he had been doing this work for over a decade. He had seen everything. Or so he thought. The moment he stepped into the garage, something felt off. The air was thick with the sharp bite of chemicals. At first, he assumed it was industrial cleaner, maybe bleach, maybe lye. But then he noticed the damp concrete, the way the smell clung to the walls. He set up his equipment, running his tools through the pipes, expecting the usual buildup, grease, food waste, maybe even a dead rat. But as his machine whirred and churned, something surfaced, a thick, dark sludge. At first he thought it was just residue. Then he saw something pale, soft, half dissolved. He lifted it carefully, turning it over in his gloved hand. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen human tissue before. Chris had been a medic in the army. He had held dying men in his arms, had seen bodies torn apart by gunfire, had smelled human decomposition. He knew what he was looking at. He didn't say anything to Lenny, didn't react. He simply stood up, walked outside, and pulled out his phone. First he called his supervisor, then he called 911. By 4:48 p.m. the police arrived. The moment the officers stepped into the garage, the stench hit them. Even seasoned detectives recoiled. They followed the smell to the plastic containers, and when they pried one open, the truth spilled out. What had once been Celeste Whitaker was now a thick, sludgy mass, partially broken down but still leaving behind undeniable proof. The acid had done its work, but it had not erased everything. There was no retreat, no sudden trip. Celeste had never left the house. She had been here all along. Elijah Whitaker was inside the house when the police arrived, unaware, unsuspecting. Sitting at the kitchen table, headphones in, scrolling through his phone. The officers moved through the home quickly, their boots heavy against the hardwood floor. Outside squad cars lined the street, their flashing lights bathing the house in streaks of red and blue. Neighbors had gathered on their porches, whispering, watching. When the officers found Elijah, he looked up, confused. "What's going on?" He had no idea. At first, they didn't tell him. They only asked where his father was. When he said Lenny was in his study, they told him to stay where he was. One officer remained with him, while the others continued their search. Minutes later, the shouts started. Lenny had locked the door to his study, but it didn't take much for the officers to break it down. They found him sitting at his desk, staring at the DNA test results. The same results that had set this nightmare into motion. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply looked up, hands shaking, and asked, "Is Elijah okay?" The officers didn't answer. They pulled him to his feet, cuffed his hands behind his back, and led him out of the room. Elijah stood in the hallway, eyes wide, frozen in place. He watched as his father, the man who had raised him, the man he trusted more than anyone, was pushed past him in handcuffs. "Dad?" Lenny turned his head, but he didn't speak. His face was pale, hollow. It was only then, only in that moment, that Elijah felt the first sting of fear. One of the detectives, a woman with a calm voice, sat him down at the kitchen table. She asked him when he last saw his mother. Elijah hesitated. "Last week, I think?" He frowned. "No, wait, maybe longer. My dad said she was on a trip." She asked if he had spoken to her, if she had called or texted. "No, but that's normal. She doesn't always check in when she's at those church retreats." The detective nodded, then carefully, gently told him the truth. His mother had never left the house. She had been killed here, in their own home. His father had dissolved her remains in acid. Elijah's breath hitched. That's not true. But the detective didn't look away. She wasn't lying. She wasn't playing some sick joke. His mother was gone. His father was the reason why. And then came the final betrayal. The detective told him about the DNA test, about what his father had discovered, about Maurice, his uncle, his real father. Elijah didn't speak, didn't move. The world had shifted beneath him, and he was falling, falling, falling. Everything he had ever known, his family, his identity, his entire life, had been a lie. Leonard Whitaker was arrested on January 22, 2024. The moment the officers placed him in the back of the squad car, Houston was already waking up to the horror of what he had done. A respected pastor, a devoted father, a man of faith, and yet, beneath it all, a murderer. By the time news of his arrest spread, the entire city was talking. The congregation that had once admired him was in disbelief. Neighbors who had once greeted him with warm smiles now whispered in hushed tones. The man they had trusted, the man who had baptized their children, had killed his own wife and tried to erase her from existence. The trial began weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, spectators, former church members who had once looked up to Lenny now sat in silence, waiting to hear the details of his crime laid bare. From the very beginning, the prosecution held nothing back. They presented forensic evidence, traces of human tissue found in the plumbing, the containers of acid recovered from the garage. They showed receipts and security footage from the industrial supply store where Lenny had calmly purchased the chemicals he used to dispose of Celeste's body. Witness testimonies painted a picture of a man who had hidden his rage for years only to let it explode in an act of cold, calculated violence. But the most damning evidence of all came from Lenny himself. His confession was played for the jury, his voice flat, emotionless, as he described the moment he confronted Celeste, the rage that overtook him, the silence that followed. He admitted to every detail, the killing, the disposal, the lies. The defense fought desperately to save him. They argued that he had suffered a temporary psychotic break, that discovering Celeste's betrayal had pushed him into a state of uncontrollable fury. They painted him as a man who had simply snapped. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for only 2 hours. On February 9, 2024, they returned with a verdict: guilty. When the judge read the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, Lenny barely reacted. He sat still, his hands folded in his lap, his face unreadable. The judge's words cut through the silence. "Your actions were calculated, cruel, and beyond justification." Lenny didn't speak. He didn't beg for mercy, maybe because he knew there was none left for him. In the days following the verdict, as Leonard Whitaker was led away in handcuffs to serve his life sentence, the world outside the courtroom kept turning. But for those left behind in the wake of his crime, nothing would ever be the same. Maurice Whitaker, now in Atlanta, Georgia, was forced to face a past he never expected to resurface. When reporters reached out, his response was brief. He had no idea. Elijah was his son. Questioned but never charged, his only crime seemed to be not knowing the truth. That truth had been buried for years. Maurice and Celeste had been together once before she married Leonard. It was a mistake, one they never spoke of again. Years later, during a brief stay at their home, it happened again. A moment of weakness, followed by a lifetime of silence. Celeste knew, but she never said a word. For 17 years, she watched her son grow up under another man's love, carrying a secret she believed would never come to light, until Leonard took that test. Now, the truth had destroyed everything. Back in Houston, the community was in shock. Their once admired leader had committed an unthinkable crime, but many were just as stunned by Celeste's secret. Some saw her as a woman trapped by her choices, others as someone who built her life on deception. Then there was Elijah. At 17, he had lost everything. His mother, gone, his father, a murderer, and Uncle Maurice was actually his real father.